All right, everyone. If you're watching this, then that means you are starting Biology 3120 Research Design Analysis here at CSUB. As your instructor, I have laid out some information here in this video to hopefully help you in your first lab exercise. In this lab, we will rely heavily on Excel. And Excel isn't exactly everyone's cup of tea or they're comfortable with it. And so I'm making this video to hopefully help walk you through some of the potentially confusing steps to help you create your first table and your first figure. And this video is not designed to be a video that will help you create all your tables and all your figures. This is just to help you kind of work through the first motions and practice at creating that first table and figure. We will be doing other things with tables and figures, but this still should hopefully provide a foundation upon which you can rely that will help your experience learning Excel in this class. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at our data set. So the only thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to increase the text size so that you guys can see a little better what I'm looking at. Now, the data are arranged in rows right now. We got an estuary row and an intertidal row. Now, just a brief background on this data set. Each one of these cells represents a value that is a measurement of the length of a claw of a crab in millimeters. So all of these are millimeters. And so this represents 9 different crab claws or crabs that had one of their claws measured in an estuary water type, which is an estuary is where a river meets the ocean. It's kind of that, you have salt and fresh water coming together. And then we have an intertidal zone. And this is, think of like where you go tide pooling. That's the intertidal zone where the waves are crashing. There's pools of water surrounded by rock, etc. So crabs live in both estuary and intertidal areas. And what we're interested in finding out is whether or not the type of water affects their claw size. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to want to do with this data set is we're going to want to transpose it. And we can work with it the way that it is. It's just going to make it a little easier to work with if we transpose it. So all I did was I highlighted everything here, and I'm going to right click copy. And then just down here, I'm going to just plop everything in this cell here. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to select under the paste options, I'm going to select the transpose option. Okay. And all transposing did was it just shifted the data set from a row format to a column format. Okay. Now, at this point, what we need to do for your first lab exercise, you're asked to create or calculate the mean and the standard deviation for your data set that's provided to you. So we're going to do that here. We're going to do the mean, the standard deviation. We're also going to do the sample size. And so I'm going to leave myself a space here, a row, an intentional blank row. All right. And I'm going to do that with all the data sets that you see me working with in this class. And we're going to have the mean, and we're going to have standard deviation. Now, we'll talk about the symbols for these different statistics as we move forward, but the mean can be represented by the symbol X bar and standard deviation by little s. And we'll kind of talk about that here in a little while. But the first thing we're going to want to do is calculate the mean. Now, there are several different ways of doing this, but the way we're going to do this is to make life a little easier on us. And so we are going to use the built-in formulas that Excel already has. And to tell Excel to execute one of these formulas, you need to start off in an empty cell with equals. You put in equals. Now Excel is ready for you to type in some functions. Okay. And so sum is here. You have all these other ones. So, I mean, we could even click average and it plops average in, and it's even auto recognizing the cells that we want. Okay. So that's kind of a shortcut way of doing it, but we'll go ahead and just do it the long way here. Okay. And so we're going to type in equals, and we're going to just start typing the word average, and you'll notice that average pops up. This is the first one we want, so we just double click that. Now it's giving us the option of selecting our cells. And so we want to tell Excel to take the average of these cells here, okay, for the estuary group. We're going to close our parentheses and select enter. Okay, so now we have a mean for our estuary group. Now we'll get to the mean and standard deviation for the intertidal group here in a moment, but let's go ahead and do our standard deviation. So for standard deviation, similar to the mean, you're going to type in equals, and you're going to do ST. And as soon as you type in ST, you're going to get some options here. We're going to want to select the STDEV.S. So we're going to double click that guy. And this is simply the sample standard deviation. And as the mean, we're going to highlight same cells. We're going to close our parentheses and hit enter. So now we have our mean and we have our standard deviation for our estuary sample here. We're also going to want to do our sample size. And this also has a variable, and I'll show you the variable when we create our table. But for sample size, we're going to be doing another formula, and this is going to be equals count. There's count, the first option there. We want just count. Open our parentheses, select our same cells, close parentheses, select enter. We now have our sample size, and we can confirm that, right? We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have 9 there. We have 9 here. So now we've calculated. Now we've calculated our 3 numbers or values that we need to put our first table together. Now, our first table, we're going to be putting sample size in the table, but for many of the tables that you create throughout this course, we're not going to add sample size to the actual table. We're going to be putting it in the table caption. But just to make this a little more of a table with more information in it, we're adding sample size to it for now. Okay. Before we get into creating our table, however, we want to calculate these same metrics for our intertidal zone. Now, there's a few different ways of doing that. We can simply repeat this process by just typing in the same formulas and highlighting these cells and just repeat that process, right? That's obvious. There are a couple of shortcuts. Now, by putting your rows, or excuse me, putting your data in these columns, we can simply do 2 things. We can highlight these 3 boxes, right click and go to copy. Select this cell, right click and go to paste, just the first paste option. And you'll notice that we have different values here. A couple of these values are the same, sample size, because we sampled the same number of crabs in the intertidal area, but these values are different. Now, if we click on one of these cells and we inspect the actual formula up here in the formula bar, we'll see that it's now taking the average of D6 to D14. Okay. And so that was simply just copying and pasting our formula or these cells here. And by doing so, we're copying and pasting the formulas, because this is the actual information that's in the cell. We're seeing 31.6. But the actual, you click on this cell and 31.6 is not what Excel is seeing. Excel is seeing a formula. And so when we copy and paste, we're just pasting that formula. And that formula is just pulling from different numbers, which is why we have different numbers here. So that's a second way of doing it, right? First way, of course, is just retyping out all the formulas. The third way is highlighting everything here, just like we did. And instead of copying and pasting it, you hover over the lower right-hand section of our selection, and you want your cursor to turn from a thick white cross to a thin black cross. Once you have that, click, hold, and drag to the next column. And you'll notice the same thing happens when we copy and paste the values. Okay. So now we have the values that we need to create or generate our table. So I'm just going to grab some empty space over here and start my table. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is put table 1 and a period. Now, I'm not going to exactly go through writing out our table at this point or the caption for it, but I am going to start our table. Now, the first thing we want to do is put in our grouping variable. So I'm going to type out groups here, okay? And we'll come back and change this. But our groups are estuary. Well, let me capitalize that. And intertidal. All right, so we got both of these are our groups. Now, what are these groups? Okay, and these groups are types of water. So we're going to replace groups with type of water. All right, the next thing we want to do, so type of water is our grouping variable. We have estuary and intertidal as those individual groups. We want our mean in here. So we're going to put mean. And mean is also represented as X bar, which is a little tricky to do in Excel, but it's a capital X with a bar over the top of it. But because it's kind of tricky and challenging, we're just going to stick to mean. The next one is our standard deviation. Now, standard deviation is often abbreviated to SD, which stands for standard deviation. And the way we're going to be referring to standard deviation in this class is by little s. So little s represents our standard deviation. And anytime you use a variable like this in a table, it needs to be italicized. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to come up here, press the I for italic, and now we have our little s is italicized. So that's our standard deviation. So here we have X bar, that's the symbol. Standard deviation, we have little s. Sample size, our symbol ends up being little n. And so we're going to put in a little n here. And similar to the little s, our little n should also be italicized. Okay. So now we've built essentially our structure for our table. And we're going to simply now just start filling that information in. Now, a couple ways of doing this. You can simply type the values. So for example, the mean of estuary was 31.6. I could just type that in. There's a more efficient way of doing this that you may find to be helpful as we proceed through this course. Again, this is optional, but I found this to be very helpful for me. Equals, so I'm telling Excel, now Excel, pay attention, I'm going to be telling you to do something. What I'm telling it to do is just refer to another cell. And so I'm going to click on this cell because that's the value I want to pull. And I click enter. So now the formula, this is a formula essentially for Excel. Excel sees equals C16. And when it does that, it spits out the value for C16, which is 31.6. Now we're going to do the same thing for intertidal. I'm going to click on the mean for it. And the same thing for standard deviation for both groups. And the same thing for sample size for both groups. So at this point, we have essentially the meat and bones of our table, but we're not done with it. We want our table to look presentable, okay? And so a couple of things we're going to do. We'll eventually copy and paste this table over into Word, because that's where you prepare your reports and your papers. You submit those in Word. So we are going to do a couple of things first, okay? Now, type of water, this is what we call a text column, because the column or the values under this column header are text. Mean, standard deviation, and sample size, these are all numerical columns, because all of the information that falls under these column headers are numbers. Anytime you have a numerical column, you want to center the data. So I'm highlighting everything here, and I'm going to go up here and just center the data, okay? Anything that's text, we want it to stay left justified, so we leave it as is. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to standardize the number of digits that people are looking at in this, okay? And so a couple of ways of doing this. We'll just go ahead and pick 1 decimal place at this time, but we're going to change all of this to 1 decimal place to clean it up and make it look a little easier on the eye. So we're going to go to Format Cells. We're going to change the category from general to number, and we're going to change the decimal places to 1. Click OK. And now we have something that's a little more presentable. Now you'll notice I didn't do that with sample size, because your sample size shouldn't have any decimals with it, because it should be whole number counts, whole number values. So we're almost done, but we're pretty much done to the point where we can take this over to Word. So we're gonna copy the entire table here. And let's take this over to light mode. And I'm going to paste it. All right, so we have our table. We have our values just like we had. Now we need to make things look a little better. Okay, so now it's recognizing this as part of our table when in fact it's not. Okay, so you can get around this by, we can just start over, go back here, and you can copy everything below the table 1 so that it's not counting this as a cell. That might be a little easier. And instead, at this spot, I'm going to undo. So I just undid my previous actions there. I'm going to type table 1, put a period, click enter, and now I'm going to copy this stuff and drop it over here. So now this is separate. So now we can type this and it's not going to be bound by a cell. Okay. The reason why I have this table 1 here is just so that we remember we need to put our table caption above our table. Okay. Let's go back to our Word document. If we click this little plus sign with the arrows, it's going to show us the extent of our table. Now, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to click this first column, and I'm going to hover over the edge between column 1 and column 2. And when this symbol pops up that you can see here, I'm going to double click. And all that did was expand or open that up. So now that everything is on 1 line instead of 2 like it was before. So what we're going to want to do with our table at this point is we're going to want to add upper and lower lines, boundary lines to this particular row. And so we can do that by going to Home, and under here where the borders are found, this first one, it's adding a bottom border. So we'll just click the mouse and you'll notice it added a bottom border. While this is all still highlighted, we're going to click the drop down and we're going to add a top border. And we're going to come down here, highlight the inner title row, and we're going to click on the bottom border. So now we have a table that looks pretty good. Okay. And so the only thing that we are missing at this point would be to fill out our table caption. And that is something that we will talk through in lab. But at this point, we have our table done, okay? I'm going to go ahead and give myself a little bit of space because we're going to come back to this document with our figure. So I have some space here. I'm just going to minimize that guy. We're going to go back into our Excel sheet here. So now we want to create our graph. Now creating a graph is not super complicated, but it can be. And so hopefully you find these steps to be helpful. We're going to highlight our grouping variables and their mean values. Okay, we're not going to worry about highlighting the column headers here or the standard deviations or the sample size or anything like that. Okay, we're just highlighting this because we want to start our graph with the means on the plot. And so that's the first thing we're going to graph is the means. So we're going to go up to insert. We're going to come over here to our charts section of the ribbon, and you're going to click the drop down arrow and the very first option, the line graph. Click the line graph. Now you'll notice that we have a graph. Now I'm going to minimize this a little bit here so we can still see what's going on. And we can probably go a little bit bigger. All right, so now we have our graph. What we want to do with our graph, I'm going to move it down here. What we want to do with our graph is first we want to get rid of this line, and we want to replace this line with actual values, because we'll see that estuary, the mean value 31.6, that's that value right there. For intertidal 27.1, that's that value right there. But we don't need this line. So I'm going to double click on this line, and you'll notice that a sidebar opened up. It's called Format Data Series. Okay, we're going to go into the paint can very first. And we are going to take the line away. So when you're under the line, click no line. The line's gone, but you'll notice that we have a couple of squares here. These are our actual values. And so instead of the line, we want to go to marker, marker options, click built-in, and then come down here and click fourth from the bottom, and it should be kind of hyphens or dashes. Okay, we'll leave the size as default, and we're going to take the border off of these. So we'll go no line for border. And our fill, we want to change fill to black. So at this point, we should have 2 dashes. Now these represent the locations of the means for estuary and intertidal. The next thing we want to do is we want to add error bars to this. Now for this particular exercise today in lab, we're going to be using standard deviations. But in other labs, we're going to be using the standard error and 95% confidence intervals. The same process I'm going to show you here will apply to using standard error and confidence intervals, or at least representing those error bars on your graphs. Okay, so the same process. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to click on the graph, and that's going to pop up these 3 options here. Okay, and this is allowing us to add chart elements. Alternatively, by clicking on the graph under chart design up in the ribbon, you can do the same thing. You can add chart elements here. Okay, but we'll go ahead and use the shortcut method. We're going to go to error bars, and instead of clicking on error bars, I'm going to follow the little arrow to the right. And I'm going to go down to more options. Now, under the more, you'll notice that it put some error bars around our values. We don't want those error bars. Okay, so we're going to go over here to the error bar options on the far right of the sidebar. I'm going to click custom. And we're going to click this little square here that says specify value. Now, this specify value, this top box, we're going to delete everything that's there. This is our positive error value box. This is going to tell Excel how far above the mean your error bar should go. And so what we're going to do, and for this box, we're going to highlight the standard deviation values for both groups, estuary and intertidal. So now this is telling Excel that it needs to put this value on top of the mean for both of these groups. The negative error value, we're going to follow the same process. We're going to highlight these two cells. So now what we're telling Excel is take the same values and subtract them from the mean. So we hit OK, and you'll notice that we have our error bars. Now, the standard deviation for estuary is smaller. It's 2.5 millimeters above the mean and 2.5 below the mean, whereas the intertidal is 3.4 above the mean and 3.4 below the mean. So it's got a slightly wider standard deviation, okay? So at this point, we have our data presented on our graph. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to clean this graph up and we're going to make it presentable and professional. So you don't have to, there's no specific order to do this. So I'm just going to kind of, do it as I see fit, but you can change the order up if you want. I'm going to get rid of the chart title. Okay. So I'm going to click on the chart title. Make sure that just that box is highlighted. Click delete. I'm then going to get rid of these gray grid lines. Okay, so all I did was click one of them and they all pop up. Click delete. Okay, now things are cleaning up and it's kind of coming into view a little bit here. The next thing is I want to add in my axis lines. So I'm going to click on the axis here, and I'm going to go over here to the sidebar. And under axis options, or excuse me, under the paint can, I'm going to go to line, solid line, and make sure that that's black. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing for the x-axis. I'm going to go to solid line, and it automatically filled into black. Okay, so now we have our axis lines. Next thing we want to do is add our axis tick marks. So click on this axis again, except this time we're going to minimize axis options. We're going to go to tick marks. On the y-axis, we want to select major type outside. And then you're done. Then click on the x-axis. And for the x-axis, you want, under tick marks, you want the minor type on the outside. Okay, we want our ticks directly above our groups. Okay. All right. So things are looking a little better, but we're still missing some stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on the graph, anywhere on the graph, and we're going to go back to this plus to add chart elements. We're going to add axis titles. So I'm just going to check this one box, and both axis titles are going to pop up. You can also click the little hat and add those individually, but by clicking this major box or this first box, everything pops up. So now we're going to put in what we need here. Now, again, the grouping variable we have is type of water. So I'm just going to put that in there, type of water. There's my grouping variable. And for my y-axis, like I told you at the beginning in the background of this data set, we went out and measured the length of crab claws. And so this is going to be claw length. And we need to put our units in parentheses, and these are in millimeters. Okay. So now our graph is looking a lot better. Okay. We got a couple of things we need to do before we can copy and paste this graph over into our Word document. We want to change the color of the font to black. You might be able to notice that it's a gray color. So a quick way of doing that is clicking the outside edge of the figure and then going up into the Home tab, changing this font color to black. You'll notice that everything darkened right up. Okay, so now we got a nice black text, nice black lines. Things are looking really good at this point. The next thing is we have a thin gray border around this entire graph. So let's say we're ready to copy and paste this. So let's copy this graph. Let's take it over to our Word document, and this is where we want to plop it. And so we paste it in there. You'll notice now that that gray line around the graph is very obvious, right? It wasn't very obvious in Excel, but we don't want that in there. It looks tacky, right? So let's get rid of that. So let's go back to Excel, and with the graph still selected, okay, just selecting anywhere on the graph, under the paint can, we want to go to border, and we want to select no line. Now you'll notice that that line disappeared, okay? And we can confirm that by, by right-clicking, copying, right-clicking, pasting. Now that line is gone, okay? So it looks a lot better. Now, we go back into our data. Sometimes when you're making graphs, you want to eliminate or minimize a bunch of empty white space. Sometimes you want values to show up in your on your graph to emphasize where 0 is or some other value, okay? And so one thing we're going to want to do, and this was the other one. We don't need the decimal places on this one, so we'll go ahead and get rid of those, and then we'll repaste our graph back in. So let's get rid of the decimals first, and then we'll come back to the point I was trying to make. Click on the y-axis, bring the y-axis up, and you're going to go under number, and under number, you're going to take decimal places, where you're going to put a 0 in for decimal places. That took the decimal places away, and things are looking a little more simplified, okay? A little easier for our reader to interpret and understand this graph. Now there's less to look at. But so back to my previous point, it can sometimes be beneficial to minimize some of this empty space. So all of our data and information is located towards the top of this graph. But if we want to center it to actually emphasize and stretch this information visually out a little bit more so our reader can appreciate it more, we can click on the y-axis, and under minimum, we can change the bottom bound from 0 to something that is closer to the middle. We'll put 15 for now, but you can mess around and do other numbers and see what looks good. So this now is this is centralizing the data that we want to present, so that now the reader's not going to be distracted by so much white space at the bottom. Okay, again, this is something that's optional. You don't have to do this for every graph. And this is a little more kind of finer details in graph production. Sometimes you may want that 0 to be evident on your y-axis. And so we click reset and go back, okay? And so this really depends on the person building the graph and what they want their reader to see. Okay, so we're going to keep the 0 on here for now, and we're going to go ahead and copy this graph now that we've completed it and paste it in our Word document. Okay, so we gave ourselves some space there. We're going to copy this sucker in, and we need to put in our figure caption. Okay, and so figure 1, and then you'd add your caption. Now, similar to the table 1 caption, your figure 1 caption will be something that you go over in lab with your professor, with me. All right. Anyhow, so that is what I wanted to present to you guys, so that you kind of have at least a reference to go back to, because I understand in lab this can be confusing trying to remember all these steps, and Excel can be a challenging program, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with it. So hopefully you can use this video as a support and as an aid to help you creating your first tables and graphs in this course. And if you have any questions, like always, do not hesitate to reach out. Goodbye.